Well, greetings. Welcome to episode 55 of Bible 180, 180 episodes between Genesis and Revelation. Today, we're going to talk about a strange little story in 2 Kings chapter 4 about the Shunammite woman. Now, as we begin that, think to yourself for a moment about of all the actions you take during a day, all the different decisions that you make during a day, what percentage of those actions or decisions do you think reflect your obedience, complete obedience to God? What percent of your time would you consider to be, what percent to be completely sold out, being in obedience to God? Think, what percentage of my life is directly in line with what I know God wishes me to be? And then think to yourself, if it's less than 98.5%, think to yourself, what percentage of my life would I like to be reflective of obedience to God? What percent would I really like to be obedient, but I sometimes fall short? Think about the gap that most people have between their true obedience and the amount that they'd like to be obedient in terms of percentage of the decisions that you make each day and the way that you spend your time. Think about that gap, because what I'd like to focus on the Shunammite woman is on those people who would like to narrow that gap between where they are and where they wish that they would be, narrowing the gap and being more obedient to God's wishes for your life. Now, the reason I'd like to focus on that is because the Bible is full of stories about people who initially weren't obedient to God, but actually grew in their obedience. Think, for instance, of Moses, who had all kinds of excuses why he couldn't obey God, and going back and forth to the Pharaoh so that the people of Israel would be let go. Gideon was a person that we saw who initially told God, "You got the wrong guy. That isn't me, this mighty warrior. That's not me." Jeremiah, that we'll see, says, "Lord, I'm just a youth. I'm 14 years old. I can't do that." Jonah, remember Jonah, initially refused. He went in the complete opposite direction of where God was calling him to do. We'll talk in a couple episodes about Esther, who was afraid that the king wouldn't welcome her, and so she thought she would just be put to death if she obeyed God. You know, the Bible is full of stories of reluctant, obedient people who are reluctant in their obedience, but who ultimately did what God was asking them to do. God used Moses to free the Israelites from slavery in Egypt. God used Gideon to defeat the Midianites. God used Jeremiah to warn people about God's judgment for sin and give them the promise of a new covenant of forgiveness. God used Jonah to call the people of Nineveh to repentance, and God used Esther to save the Jewish people. So if there's a gap in your life between how obedient you are to God and how much you would like to be obedient to God, there's hope for you. You just have to do what each one of those persons did and offer what you have to God to see what God does with what you have to offer. To further that discussion, we'll think about this little story of the Shunammite woman in 2 Kings 4. It's from 850 BC, during the time of the divided kingdom that we've been talking about. The 10 northern tribes of Israel and the 2 southern tribes of Judah following Rehoboam. Both Rehoboam and Jeroboam in the northern kingdoms were bad kings. The story takes place in the northern kingdom, where Elisha had become the prophet after Elijah goes up to heaven in a chariot. And Elisha was traveling through a little unremarkable town called Shunem. He's going from town to town proclaiming God's will and word. The woman, the Shunammite woman, the star of the story, is actually a woman who had just been widowed. She was with no visible means of support, and she was in debt to the debtor who wanted to take away her 2 sons as slaves until she was able to pay her bet. She was in a bad way. So she cries out to Elisha. She says, "Your servant, my husband, is dead," meaning her husband knew Elisha and believed in his prophecies. And the Shunammite woman continues, "You know that my servant, your servant, her husband, feared the Lord, but a creditor has come to take my 2 children as slaves." Elisha says, "So what shall I do for you? Tell me, what do you have in the house?" And the woman says, "I have nothing in the house except a jar of oil." Now, what's fascinating about this exchange is that it's an early example, a kind of a paradigm about how God works. Remember our our lesson from Elisha, 800 or so BC, and it starts to introduce a consistent pattern, which is one of the most earliest examples, and it gets repeated over and over again all the way through the Old Testament and into the New. She cries out to Elisha. She says, "Your servant, my husband, is dead. You know your servant feared the Lord, but a creditor has come to take my own 2 children as slaves." Elisha says, what shall I do for you? Tell me, what do you have in the house? She says, "I've got nothing except a jar of oil." Now, can you see the pattern? It's what I call the what you got pattern that is reflective in how a person in great need comes to a prophet or God or Jesus with a crisis. The prophet or Jesus, instead of immediately resolving the crisis, says, "What you got?" And the person says, "Ain't got nothing." And the response is, "Awesome, I can work with that. That's great, that's all I need." And then the miracle happens. Now, in the case of the Shunammite woman, Elisha told her to go out and get as many jars and vessels as she could. He says, "Gather as many from your friends and neighbors as you can, and when you have got as many as you can, start pouring that little jar of oil into the empty pot, which will be miraculously filled, and then pour the oil into the next pot." So the Shunammite woman does what she's told. She puts her faith in action. She puts her belief in the Word of God and realizes she must act in obedience. She didn't have much. I ain't got much. But she offered what she had to God and then watched what God would do with it. She got both of her sons. They got out as many empty vessels as they could. They went into the house after they had collected from neighbors and friends, and they started pouring that little jar of oil into the empty vessels, and it kept pouring and pouring and pouring. It poured out to the first, and then the second, then the third, and the oil flowed until every single vessel and pot and pan in the house was filled. The woman yells out to her sons, "Hey, do we have any more vessels?" And they said, "Nope, that's the last one." And then the oil stopped flowing. Every vessel in the house was miraculously filled. And the woman and her sons took the oil, they sold it to their neighbors and friends. They had plenty of money to pay off their debts and even more left over. Can you see the what you got pattern? She comes to the prophet of God and says, "I've got a crisis." The prophet, instead of immediately resolving the crisis, says, "What you got?" She says, "I ain't got nothing." Prophet says, "Great, awesome, I can work with that." And then the miracle happens. Remember, Moses was called in the burning bush, and God said, "I want you to lead my people into the promised land." God says to Moses, "What you got?" Moses says, "I ain't got much. I ain't got nothing. I got a stick." God says, "Awesome, I can work with that." God says, "I'm going to use that to have you part the Red Sea, to bring water from a rock, and all of that stuff. I'm going to work miracles through what you got. Little shepherd boy, David, standing before Goliath. God says, what you got? David said, ain't got much. I got 5 smooth stones and a sling. God says, awesome. I can work with that. That's just what I need. And then the miracle happens. They offered to God what they had. And then a miracle happens. Jesus, with a crowd of hungry people, are hungry. They're coming to him. Ain't got nothing. Jesus says to one of the disciples, what you got? They say, ain't got much. I got 5 loaves and 2 fish. God says, oh, we can work with that. And 5,000 men, plus women and children, probably 10, 12,000 of people were fed. The what you got miracle pattern is a prominent pattern throughout the Bible, and it shows one of the ways that God works with people. When we're obedient to God, when we present our hearts as empty vessels and say, ain't got much, but would like more, God fills them to overflowing. What we need is to offer to God what we have and let God do the rest, and then the miracle happens. But the first step of obedience is so important, offering what we have, even though it might not be much, even though we might think, I ain't got nothing. I ain't got nothing. But God works with that, and the miracle happens. That is such an important lesson from the Bible. So at the beginning, I asked you, what's your level of obedience? And what is the level that you wish it would be? Where is that gap? Where is that gap between what it is and what you would like it to be? For most of us, we're just busy with all kinds of things happening in our lives. I mean, think of the busyness that you already have in your life. But even in the midst of that busyness, if there's a gap between how you are obedient and how much you would like to be obedient, then offer what you have to God and say, God, work with me, use me, mold me, shape me into an obedient child of God in my day-to-day life. If you've got 15 or so minutes to watch this video day after day, twice a day, however that might be, when you're walking, driving, whatever it might be, I hope that this time together with you and all of these episodes will bring your heart closer to God, because knowing and experience God's love and God's grace in a relationship that's real and personal, that's what all this is all about. To begin with thinking it's going to be a great day opens your mind to what God might be doing around you and being able to see what God is doing. If you think, oh, today is going to be horrible, your receptors are not going to be open to the way in which God works. Offer to God what you have, even if you ain't got much, and watch the miracle that happens. You take care, make it a great day, and I will see you at the next episode. Bye-bye.